I am from Florida, originally South Florida, proud University of Florida Gator. Don't hold that against me if you're from another state that we're against and don't work well with. I started my career as a teacher. I taught English in high school and junior high. Took off time to have my children. I have 2 children and 3 great-grandchildren. 3 grandchildren who are great, not that they are my great-grandchildren. When my children started going to school, I started to freelance write. Was selling just enough, I guess, to keep my ego going, but not enough to keep our dogs in kibbles and bits. So I ultimately stopped freelancing and went to work. I was in the nonprofit area as doing marketing, direct marketing. Then I went on and went to a seminar company, started out as a copywriter and editor, and retired finally as director of the seminar division for marketing for them. I have always wanted to write. It took me 40 years to actually get to writing a novel. So it's been a little bit of a journey for me, definitely. Ashes was in my head for those 40 years, and it's based on or a tribute to my grandparents and my great aunts and uncle who came to this country from Austria, not from Russia. In the book, it's Russia. And they all basically found work in the garment industry in one form or another. The women were seamstresses, the men were cutters. They were one of my uncles was a furrier, one of them made hats, but they all worked under the circumstances and conditions that were as poor as they are described in the book. I want to be clear, though, that they came to this country in 1912, which is a year after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. They were not involved in the fire, but they had friends who either lost loved ones or knew of family members that had been very badly injured in the fire. When I was growing up, all of my great aunts and uncles and my grandparents were living in South Florida. They were very close. And as a child, I grew up listening to stories about the garment industry, and they stuck with me for a very long time. So when I finally retired, I kind of ran out of excuses for not writing the book. I dabbled a little bit in freelancing again, did internet work, and just decided that it was time to knuckle down and write the book. So that's how the book came about. The fire is kind of the centerpiece of the book, but there are other historical events in the book too. There is the Kishinev pogrom, which happened in Russia. It was a real event, a true event. Much of what is in the book is based on actual occurrences during that pogrom. And then when they come to America, of course, the trip over is never pleasant, was never pleasant for immigrants. So we covered that. And then another historical event in the book is the first general strike in the garment industry. Very impactful, not only for the way the girls were treated, and they were treated very poorly. They were harassed, they were arrested, they were spit at, they were hurt. The police hurt them. The police were on the payroll of the government and on the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and other owners were paying the police to harass the women on the lines. But not only did the strike impact the workers and working conditions, it was actually became the model for the suffragette movement. Later on, the success of the strike became a model for how the women went after vote, which was very, very important. And then ultimately the book takes you to the fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was in 1911. At the time, the shirtwaist, which I don't know if people know what it is, it was a blouse that looked, if you know what the Gibson girl blouse looked like, it was very high-necked, it was form-fitting and long. That had become it was a major change in fashion for women. And a very fancy one was worn by the very wealthy, and the very plain ones became part of the uniform of the working girl at the time. So there were factories all over New York churning out these very inexpensive blouses, and they were all being worked by immigrants, young immigrants, primarily Italian and Jewish immigrants who came to the country looking for work. And the reason the owners wanted these young women and young men, the immigrants working in their factories, is that they did not know what their rights were, what few rights they had at the time. And they would work for very little money. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was the worst in terms of conditions, safety conditions. The doors were locked with the exception of one because the owners were afraid that the workers would steal. What would they steal? They could steal needles, little pieces of lace, or garment, figments, rags from the garments. Because they were so worried about that, they would lock the doors. There was one elevator for them, only one that they could use. And they were on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of the Ash building, which only had one fire escape because the building itself was fireproof. The exterior, the interior was not. So when the fire happened, the young girls and young men had very little access to escape. Many of them were burned in the factory, but many of them jumped rather than burn. A lot of the young women would just, rather than burn up in there, they jumped, and the young men too. About 50 of them, of the 146 that died in that factory, jumped. What I'd like to do is read a little bit about the fire so that you get an idea of what happened. This is based on a real event in the fire. First of all, on the outside, around the building, the fire department and police arrived within minutes of the blaze's discovery. By now, the street was clogged with thousands of onlookers screaming and turning their faces away from the atrocity of young women leaping to their deaths, crashing limp and broken to the pavement like dolls. Hopes for rescue turned into utter despair when it was discovered the fire engine's ladders only reached to the 6th floor, the fire hoses to the 7th. The safety nets spread out to catch the jumping workers quickly proved to be useless. The force of so many men and women jumping at once ripped the nets from the hands of the rescuers, while the impact of others leaping from the top floors toward gaping holes in the nets. The efforts of the firemen to fight the blaze from the ground and the rescue workers were futile. Now the police were moving the crowd back so they would not be injured by falling bodies. And then going on in the building, reaching the window, they stared in belief as the scene unfolding before them. Girl after girl climbed through the window onto the ledge. Some hesitated before jumping into the nothingness that awaited them. Most leaped wordlessly as the flames rose through the window and urged them on. Louis, the chief cutter, gently lifted a crying girl who wrapped her arms around his neck. With tears in his eyes, he carried her to the window and kissed her. Holding her away from the building, he let her drop and without hesitation followed her in death. The street was littered with broken and burned bodies. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air. One after another, the workers climbed into the ledge and chose death on the sidewalk over death in the inferno of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Each thump of a body drew screams of horror from the onlookers. As the bodies piled up, women fainted and men cried out in torment. Crazed by the carnage on the street, family members tried to break free of the police cordon in a desperate attempt to find a loved one. The torrent of water flowing from the fire hoses into the gutter ran red with blood. The girls of the Triangle kept jumping out the windows of the Ash building. And that is all based on actual first-person accounts. The research for the book was pretty extensive.